Good evening, parents and carers and other external community members joining us this evening. I do hope you are very well. Before I reintroduce our speaker this evening, because it's a familiar face to the Forest community, I just want to highlight that this is our last webinar for this academic year. And in due course, in the Parent and Carer weekly newsletter, you will receive the scheduled webinars for the Michaelmas term. I'm not sure where the year has gone, but thank you so much for joining us. And I really do hope that you have benefited from the wide-ranging topics and the wisdom from these fantastic speakers. So some of you may have already watched a previous webinar conducted by our speaker this evening, Anita. We're really hoping she can continue to add an amazing her wisdom and her professionalism and her expertise to the Forest Focal webinars as we enter into the new academic year. But as a reminder of who she is, and though actually in the presence online of someone that's got such experience in this area in terms of parenting and caring. So she is an award-winning parenting speaker, writer and coach who supports working parents and carers to balance successful careers with being a parent and carer. Anita speaks at events for working parents and carers across the UK and internationally, and she delivered webinars such as this for us all, but also at top global companies. Her books, which she's had written many, have been translated into 13 languages, so she's internationally recognised as well. And her first book, which is The Work Parent Switch, known as the Working Parent Survival Guide in the USA, outlines how parents and carers can use bits of time left over when work is done. And we know, as parents and carers watching, as well as myself, that's limited. But she helps us, Anita, to parent smarter, not harder, and be the parent their child needs in a very ever-changing and complex world, as we know. Her most recent book, How to Get Your Teenager Out of the Bedroom, came out to 5-star reviews in September 2024. And she's going to be focusing on how to get your teenagers to open up to you this evening. So if you haven't, do have a look at that book. She was recently named in the Times one of the top 5 parenting coaches in the UK, and she's regularly featured in the media, including some of the big names such as BBC, CNBC and The Telegraph, and is currently appearing as an expert in Series 2 of At Home with Catherine Ryan. She's an accredited Triple P parenting facilitator. Anita has been working with parents and carers for over 20 years on all aspects of children's behaviour and well-being. She's got a postgraduate qualification in developmental psychology, and she really has a talent for helping parents and carers step back and reflect on that dynamics when we're working with our children and implementing those small changes that make a big difference. And if you haven't seen or watched Anita's previous webinar, please do, because it will obviously be taken off the YouTube channel in due course, given obviously it not being on there for a long enough time period. But without further ado, you're going to be in safe hands with Anita. And Anita, welcome back to the Forest family.
Thank you, Natasha. Welcome, everybody. Yes, today's topic, how to get your teenager to open up to you. We're actually recording this on the day after the government announced a social media ban for under 16s in the UK, which is an interesting time to be talking about teenagers and how we support them. My aim today is really to give you some practical tips about communication with your teen, but also maybe some insight and understanding into what goes on in that dynamic, why teens might be reluctant to talk to us, why they close up, so that you have that understanding. I'm firmly of the belief that relationship is the most important factor as a parent during the teenage years. No matter what is going on with your teenager, and some teenagers take a lovely smooth route through the teenage years, and some take a slightly rockier path and have a harder time. Whatever is going on, having a good relationship with them is absolutely essential. So communication is really key to that. Now, when I say teenager, I don't mean that you have to wait till your children are 13 to kind of think about these strategies. Most teens start to become teenagers from about 11 upwards. So Cognitively, adolescence starts in that second decade. So you may well have noticed, some of you will have had the experience where you wake up one day and realize you have a teenager, and it might well have happened a year or two earlier than you were expecting. We really know when they tip over into that moment. So it might not be that they are actually 13, they may be slightly younger than that. As Natasha said, I don't really need to introduce myself. She did a lovely job on that. You know, I would really highly recommend, if you're struggling with the transition into the teenage years, and I'll talk about the fact that it can be quite brutal. We spend the first 10 years being loved, adored, having lots of cuddles, lots of attention from our children, feeling like, we can never give enough of ourselves to them, and the teenagers can hit us a bit like a train, and suddenly we've been ditched, and it's really hard to get through to them. It's really hard to get them to spend time with us, and that door is being firmly slammed in our face. So if you're struggling with that and all the emotions that go with that, how to get your teenager out of their bedroom will hopefully give you much more than I can do just in this one session. But I'll do my best to squeeze as much of it in as I possibly can. We have got resources. If you want to connect with me, if you want to find out more about me, if you want to navigate to my blog, so I write a parenting advice blog called Thinking Parenting. And on there is a section on teens. There's also a section on co-parenting, on technology. Then navigate to the blog, have a look. There are lots and lots of materials there, and the schools have got them as well to be able to disseminate that information. But you don't need to remember everything. There's a lot of resources on there, including signposting to where you might be able to get further support and help. For example, if your teen is struggling with issues around their mental health. What I'm going to try and do today is we're going to think about listening, and we're going to think about honestly what gets in the way of listening, but also why teens don't want to talk to us, what makes this a tricky area. I'm going to try and be as practical as possible, in terms of, both thinking about how we connect with teens, but really drilling down on how conversations, can go a little bit better, the sort of phrases that you might be able to use, the approaches that you might be able to take to conversations that might be more successful. And then just finishing off at the end, thinking about some of the difficult topics that you might want to make sure you do cover with your teenager, if at all possible. So, why listening matters, I think, in a nutshell, is because teens are very vulnerable. We know that this is a very vulnerable time in children's lives. They're taking quite often their first steps independently. Whereas previously, when they were younger, we might have known where they were all the time. They might have been supervised at all times. It is appropriate during the teenage years that they start to do things independently, and that means they're not always with us. So therefore they're vulnerable in terms of safety, and indeed, they'll be taking steps into the digital world one way or another. Teens also have, many teens have a predisposition towards risk taking. And that, evolutionary psychologists would argue that's all about them kind of, branching out and moving away from the family, moving away from their tribe. Not all teens do that. Some have the opposite. They have a real anxiety about risks. And this is all to do with the part of the brains that is developing during the teenage years. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But some teens who may have been quite rule abiding when they were younger can start to take risks that really we can find quite challenging and that put them in danger in some ways. It is the time of life when mental health challenges are the most likely to emerge. And alongside that, we have teens are their sexuality is starting to emerge. So they may be having thoughts and feelings that they've never had before. They might be indeed making contact sexually with people, which again, might just be putting them emotionally in a difficult position, or it could be putting them physically at risk in some ways. And alongside all of that, they've got important exams, important decisions to make about their future, about kind of post 16 choices, potentially college choices, all of that. And in the meantime, they have got lots of angst, lots of self doubt. I'm sure you can remember being a teenager and all of the worries, the doubt that comes along with that of thinking, am I good enough? Am I acceptable? Do people like me? All of the exploration of self. And that makes teens very vulnerable. And, I know you already know that. This isn't new to you, what I'm saying. And in fact, most of us are so aware of that, of all the things that could potentially go wrong for our teens, that knowledge can be unhelpful. It can get in the way of us listening. Parents can feel a lot of pressure to try to get through to teenagers, to land a message with them, and that might be about the dangers of drugs, of alcohol, of the importance of studying, or simply the message that they shouldn't feel bad about themselves. But that desire to kind of land a message with them really is a drive towards one way communication and not listening. It can get in the way. Sometimes our awareness of, you know, the struggles that our teenagers may be facing can also provoke emotions in us. And those emotions can take over and they can hijack conversations. And being the parent of a teenager involves really big emotions. You might be feeling hurt, rejected, a bit lost, old, disrespected, discarded, scared. So many feelings come along with having teenagers, and all of those feelings can come rushing into our conversations with our teens and demand to be heard. And when our emotions are taking up a lot of space and demanding acknowledgement, it's much harder for us to listen to what's going on our teenager side of the communication. And especially if it feels like things are going a bit wrong with our teenager, or a teen is not listening to us, or they're not doing the things that we think they should be doing, and we're ending up in a lot of conflict with them, or just having the same discussion over and over and over again, we can start to feel a bit negative towards our teenagers. Teenagers can behave in ways towards their parents. They can be lovely when they go to school, but towards their parents, they can behave in ways that are not nice. And we can start thinking or worrying that they've turned into not very nice people, or that we must be really bad parents or have done a really bad job for them to be behaving in that way. And then every conversation we have with our teenager becomes really loaded, and we stop listening clearly to what's going on with them. So lots of things potentially on our side get in the way of really being a good listener. And then, of course, on our teenagers' side, they're often not very motivated to talk to us anyway. The teenage developmental phase is characterized by a drive to separate from parents and by neurological developments in their brain that are not always conducive to communicating with parents and to talking to us. So my book, I talk about the 4 developmental priorities that teenagers have. And I talk about them as drives or muscles that they're building up. And those 4 are separation, individuation, stimulation, and autonomy. So separating from us, from family, working out who am I, exploring their identity, working out how they fit in wider society outside the family, particularly with their peer group, and taking control of decisions, being the person who is making decisions about their own lives. And most of teenagers' actions are driven by at least one, sometimes all of these drives all at once. And it's like they are bouncing up and down on their independence kind of legs, trying to practice these things. And often they practice it by shutting themselves away in their bedrooms, for example, closing that door so that they can, mark their separation. And behind that door, they might be exploring their identity one way or another. That might be trying on clothes, doing their makeup, exploring social media, who do I like? Who am I like? They might be using digital devices to communicate with their peer group and kind of assimilate, become part of the gang and get feedback from them about, how likable or how liked they are. And they're going to be making decisions about their own space, whether that's leaving their pants on the floor or moldy dishes and kind of taking control of their lives and their time and their space. And anything that gets in the way of those priorities is going to be experienced as a bit of a threat. And this is not because your teenager is making this decision. It's a bit like, do you remember when they were toddlers and they used to bounce up and down on their legs and cruise around the furniture, kind of strengthening their muscles, and then get very upset when you tried to stop them doing it? It was almost like an obsessive drive. Teens have this real obsessive internal developmental drive to do these things. And if we try and get in the way of them, it does cause conflict. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't sometimes get in the way of those. And really that's being driven by their brains. The teenage brain is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And you might be aware of this. You might well have read books about the teenage phase or heard other people talk about this. But during the teenage years, during adolescence, the teenage brain undergoes an upgrade process. I usually liken it to the kind of upgrade from 3G to 5G. It's all about making signals go faster. So really kind of working with the wiring in their brain to make things go faster, pruning out any unnecessary kind of pathways that are no longer being used or haven't been developed, and making things stronger and quicker. Now, that developmental work starts at the back of the brain and works towards the front of the brain. The back of the brain is the bit that keeps us alive. In the teenage years, we tend to get into this point where the mid part of the brain, which governs, that's the limbic regions that govern emotions, that govern our sense of reward, our sense of threat, those parts of the brain have been upgraded. They are sending their signals loud and clear. Whereas the front part of the brain, that lovely part of the brain, which is all about thinking things through and making balanced decisions and inhibiting distractions, thinking about being able to remember to do things, being organized. That part of the brain's still on 3G. It's there, it's working, but it can easily get knocked offline by the louder emotional kind of reward and threat driven part of the brain. And that explains why teens can be very highly reactive, why they tend to get a really big kick from rewards, why they can be, quite anxious, or why they can get a thrill out of risks. It's that part of the brain really is kind of already kind of pumped up, and it's like it's in technicolor. And particularly what influences and sets off those signals are social cues. So when we look at MRI scans of the teenage brain, things like a social threat. Now, a social threat might be a threat of exclusion, feeling left out. It might be the threat of feeling, that you might be laughed at, or of being kind of left out of something. Those social kind of signals land in the brain and really kind of have a greater neurological impact, to the extent that it almost looks like what physical pain would look like for an adult or for a younger child. When we look at the signals in their brain, they really feel social signals very strongly, and they get a very high kind of reward, a neurological reward for novelty, for thrill, and for approval, for peer approval. Now, that's some of the factors that kind of explain, teen behavior. It can also mean that they close up from parents, because the drive for separation isn't just physical, it's also about staking claim to their mental space, taking ownership of their mind, of their feelings. So, whereas a younger child might rush to kind of disclose things to us in play or to tell us things, teens are much more circumspect in what they divulge. And there can be different reasons for that secrecy. Sometimes it's self protection. When you're exploring your own thoughts, your own desires, your identity, it's much easier to do that if you can carve out a private space where there's less danger of feeling judged, and especially being judged by a parent who might have a habit of believing that they know you better than you know yourself. And when teens are secretive, it could just be that. It could be that they've got something to hide, something they don't want us to know. They might be doing or thinking something that we wouldn't approve of. And parents often assume that teens hide their wrongdoings from fear of consequences. And sometimes that's true, but often it's actually fear of losing our good opinion that weighs very heavily on teens' decision making. Contrary to what they say, they really do, you know, care what we think about them. And they desperately don't want to disappoint us or upset us. That doesn't stop them always doing the wrong things, but how we see them is part of the foundation that underpins how they see themselves. And when we think badly of them, or when we think they're failing, or that they're getting things wrong, it can confirm their worst fears, that they are getting things wrong, that they are failing, that they are unlikable. So when there's difficult stuff going on, teens often try and deal with it themselves, so as not to risk losing our good opinion, or they might resort to lying, or to covering it up. That might be one reason they don't tell us things. However, the biggest reason teens don't open up to us is very often a learnt from how we do react when they do open up to us. So when researchers asked children of all ages why they didn't talk to their mum or dad about something big and important that was difficult that was going on in their lives, the most common answer they give is that they were worried their parents would overreact, that they would get upset, or they would get angry, or that they would fly off and do something that they don't want us to do and take control. And if we're really honest with ourselves, they're not completely wrong in that fear, are they, our teenagers? The main reason you're listening to this, the main reason you want your teenager to open up to you, is so that you can find out if there is anything you should be worried about, if there is anything you should be doing. And if your teen does let on that there's something up, your emotions might well get triggered, and you probably will want to give them advice, or take action. But that is absolutely not what teenagers want. And we need to understand that. Teenagers don't always understand what's going on inside them, just as we don't. Talking is a way of exploring their thoughts, of shifting some stuck feelings, just as it is for adults. When we're alone in our heads, we're often a jumble of thoughts and feelings. And when someone that we trust asks us, "How are you feeling?" and we attempt to put that into words, then we sort of, in that process, we start to understand a little bit more what's going on, to order some of our thoughts and feelings, and to get some relief from that. But that only happens if we're given space to amble and linger in the way that we express ourselves and in the way we're disclosing things, and not fear that we're going to be cut off, or judged by the person on the other side of that conversation, jumping in and telling us what we should be doing, or how we should or shouldn't be feeling. So when teens don't open up to us, there's a pretty good chance that it's because they've decided that we're quite rubbish listeners. That's not entirely our fault. The teenage brain is primed to detect social threat. And that includes from us. So even if we are incredibly careful, teens are likely to take our well-intentioned kind of messages the wrong way. Parents want to help, teens want to be independent. Independence means doing things by yourself without help from others. So when parents offer advice, we think we're making helpful suggestions. What teenagers often hear is a threat to their autonomy. They hear a criticism. They hear us saying that we don't think they're capable of handling this by themselves, that they need us to intervene. And in reality, they might not be capable of handling it by themselves, but that's not the point. Those independence drives will come surging forward. Because remember, that teenage brain is hyper alert to social threat. And anything that makes them feel disrespected or humiliated or low status is going to fire up the alarm signals in their brain and initiate a defensive response. So, unless they are incredibly carefully delivered, teens are just as likely to feel hurt by our messages of support as they are to feel comforted, which is, what we might intend. Even really simple offers of support, especially when they come from parents, we're the people they need to separate from. That we're the ones, their amygdala is much more jumpy when it comes to us, which is why a parent's loving advice might be thrown back at you, whereas exactly the same advice, the same words from a grandparent or a coach or a teacher might be accepted as wisdom and taken on board. So communicating with teens can mean treading a really delicate path. It isn't easy, but it always means prioritizing listening over speaking. Ultimately, this is about relationship building. If your agenda is to get through to your teenager, to give them advice, to provide your hard earned wisdom and short circuit their own painful learning, then your communication is likely to fail and they're going to stop wanting to be in communication with you. But if you can learn to hold back your suggestions, listen with acceptance, with true curiosity to know what's going on for them, and provide a really non threatening space for them to explore their thoughts and feelings, then you'll be the parent that your teenager actually wants to listen to. And that's not easy to do. Believe me, I know it's not easy to do. It's easy to say. Now, before we can even have that conversation, we need to think about relationship. We can't just go marching into our teenager's bedroom and demand they open up to us. We need to be on the lookout for how we can build trust, how we can kind of maximize opportunities for connection in the really small everyday moments. For the big conversations to happen, we need to spend time with our teens. We need to build some bridges, and those might be micro bridges. A micro bridge is a tiny moment of connection that we have with our teen, and sometimes we only get the chance for a micro bridge. Maybe we don't get to see them much that day. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they are talking with friends, doing clubs and activities, or other things. But when they come out of their bedroom, maybe we pass them on the stairs, we need to make the choice to think about, how can I use that moment to build relationship, not how can I cram in everything I want to say to my teenager in this one tiny opportunity, because that is going to drive them straight back to their room and avoiding us as much as possible. So communicating with teens does also involve trying to create opportunities, being in their company, hanging out, doing things they enjoy, talking about meaningless stuff until the right moment presents itself, for a few moments of really good communication to take place. And that isn't easy. Teens often don't want to just come along with family activities. We have to compromise a lot. We have to collaborate with them. We have to really sort of make the compromises that make spending time with them possible, rather than assuming that they are going to make the compromises for us. It is worth it because we're spending that time with them and creating that relationship. It might be, with school holidays coming up, really thinking about, well, okay, what could we do in the school holidays? Little things that we might be able to do together that would involve spending time together, and asking them, oh, I'd love to spend a little bit of time with you and do a few things together. Have a think about it. What might be nice? Don't think this is necessarily going to be a big long day out. It might just be really short things. You're probably going to have to factor in the stuff that matters to them. I kind of think of spending time with teenagers as a bit like planning time with your most awkward friend, the one who always kind of, has to do it their way. And that might feel like you're the one making all the compromises, but these are compromises that we make in order to spend time with them, in order to build relationship with them, in order to be around enough to be that supportive parent that we can be. And then when we get those opportunities to communicate with them, it's really important. There's a few basic rules, I think, of communicating with teens that we should stick to. One of them is pick your moment. And that means their moment, really. It doesn't mean your moment at all. It means talking when it's right for them. If you pop into your teenager's bedroom and they are in a really grumpy mood, that's not the time to try and have a conversation. If they're churned up about something that's happened that day, or, that moment, this will not be the time to talk about future college choices or whatever it was that you had on your mind that you wanted to talk about. Sometimes teens come to us when it's the right moment for them to talk. Usually that's an inconvenient moment for us. It might be late at night when you're desperate for some sleep or you're rushing to get out of the door. However, if you can, when they come to us and make a bid for a conversation, if you possibly can, seize that moment and go along with that, even if you're longing for your bed. Take every conversational bridge that's offered to you. It's really about seizing the right moments and walking away from the wrong ones. You probably already know conversations with teens that happen side by side are often more productive and better than the ones which are face to face. So whether that's, when you're out walking the dog together, when you're driving in the car together, when you're sitting on the sofa, when you're busy doing something with them, watching sport, cooking a meal, rather than, sitting down trying to talk face to face. Those conversations flow more easily. If you've got something difficult to talk about, try going for a drive or for a walk. And think about not necessarily being direct. Being direct can put teenagers on their guard, and it can lead them, their shutters come down, they think, oh, okay, you're trying to find something out from me. That's a threat to my independence. I'm going to first of all go to defensiveness. Whereas an indirect approach works best. So that might be chatting about their favorite TV program, talking about yourself, talking about their neighbors, talking about family members, celebrities, reality TV stars. Talk about other people. And teens will often engage quite enthusiastically in those conversations in a way that helps you understand their thought processes. So if you want to, talk about ambition, watch The Apprentice with them, if that's something they want to do, or talk about celebrities, talk especially reality TV stars. Think about talking about issues and people rather than asking a direct question. That tends to lead to better conversations. Be a good role model in your communication. We have to role model how to communicate well. If you get emotional and resort to shouting or sulking or emotional blackmail in conversations, you don't really have a leg to stand on when they do that stuff as well. Be less teen, be more grown up, and invite them, treat them like the grown up that you want them to become. Assume that they are a mature young person who can communicate well, and invite them into that space rather than kind of getting dragged into behaving like a teenager. And if it all goes badly, if a conversation is fraught, don't keep pushing through. Don't keep trying to hammer home a message. Once your teenager's emotions are in the driving seat, once that part of the brain has taken over, you're unlikely to have a rational conversation. Once your emotions are engaged, it's probably not going to go well. The reasonable part of their brain that you want to be talking to is not firing at that moment. So drop it, move away. Once that rational part of their brain comes back online, you will be able to have that conversation again in another way. It is one of my biggest pieces of advice for parents of teens is walk away from the emotions, don't go into battle. And almost always you end up having a good conversation with them a little bit later. Make the bulk of your conversations good ones, and they're more likely to come into the important conversations with you. I think the other really important thing when it comes to listening and communication is we need to be a safe listener, an empathetic listener. If we want to encourage teens to open up about the big stuff, they need to feel like we can hold a safe and supportive space for them to talk. And that means keeping things calm and avoiding kind of triggering their threat response. And the best way to do that is by practicing empathetic listening. And empathetic listening is not something that always comes easily to parents. Even when we're really good listeners to our friends, maybe with your friend, you're great at just being a sounding board and letting them kind of pour it all out and just making the right noises. Even when we're good with our friends, we can struggle to do it with our children because we feel responsible for them. We feel like it's our job to fix things if things aren't going well. So when they tell us about their problems, our instinct is to convince them, oh, it's okay. It's all going to be okay. To reassure them, to tell them what we're going to do about it or what they should do about it, and jump into that fix it mode. And we start listing all the reasons why that problem, that feels so huge to them, it's not such a big problem. It's okay. It's okay. We're going to fix it. That's not empathetic listening. Empathetic listening is not about telling them how to think about something or changing their mind. It's not even about trying to make them feel better. It's certainly not about giving your opinion. It is simply about listening and letting them know that they're being heard, signaling to them that we hear both their words, but also the feelings that they're having, acknowledging what they're experiencing, completely regardless of whether that's how we would feel in that situation. It's listening without judgment in that kind of calm and accepting way. This is where you are. I see you. This is what's going on for you. I hear that. It means not assuming the role of expert or advisor. Your teenager is the expert in what they are feeling and thinking right now. And if you can adopt a position of gentle curiosity, they might just let you in. They might just give you a glimpse of what the world feels like and looks like for them. But they won't if they think that you're going to jump in and tell them how they should see this situation. So how do we do that? I know that sounds quite abstract. Well, if your teenager is having an emotion, expressing an emotion, or maybe telling you about a problem, the first thing we do is we stop, we listen, and we pay full attention. Our aim is not to stop them being upset. We need to tune out, especially if they're telling us something difficult that's maybe quite triggering. We need to tune out our alarm bells. Often when teens talk, inside we've got alarms firing off, our own worry radar. We need to tune those out, and we need to just focus calmly on listening to what they're saying and how they're saying it. And we need to zip it, not jump in with reassurance or solutions, not telling them how to feel. When there's a pause, we can name what's going on, validate it, name how much it matters to them. If they say, I hate my body, we don't rush in to tell them, contradict them, convince them, tell them they look amazing, there's nothing wrong with their body, any of those things. We just wait for a pause and we say, that's a really tough feeling to have. It sounds like you see your body as somehow less attractive or less acceptable to other people's. So we name the place that they're at, the emotion, and summarize what they've said in a way that shows we're listening. And when we can do that, it feels relieving. It's therapeutic in and of itself. It helps teens get a handle on what's going on inside them. And if you've got it wrong, if you've summarized wrong, they will tell you, they will correct you. And just being able to do that and stay calm about it helps teens go, oh, okay, mum, dad, they're not panicking here. This must be okay. This must be doable, manageable, survivable, the emotion, the situation that I'm in. And staying calm, keeping that calm atmosphere. And there is a bit of a trick for doing that, which is even if you're not feeling calm inside, is to take a deep breath and to keep your voice low and slow. So low in volume, but also low in pitch, and to speak slowly. That helps us be calm because it helps activate our parasympathetic nervous system, but it also signals really clearly to our teen that we are calm, that we are not panicking, that we're not about to fly off the handle, and it creates space in that conversation. And they need to feel secure that we can cope calmly with whatever it is that they're going to bring to us, no matter how big or bad it feels to them. And allowing them lots of space. You can be gently curious. That sounds really difficult. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that? But don't rush to fill the gaps. Allow silences, allow pauses. It might take a bit of time for them to find words or feel brave enough to speak. You might need to return to this conversation and revisit it over periods of time as trust grows. But what we're not going to do is to jump into telling them how to solve their problem. We might ask them what they want to happen next. Do you want me to give you ideas, or do you just want me to listen? Or have you found anything so far that seems to help or that seems to work? If we can learn to listen in that way, in that supportive way, it not only has a really therapeutic impact, but it helps your teen learn to manage those situations, but it builds a relationship in which they feel confident to come to us with the difficult stuff. Now, we can use empathetic listening for big stuff, for small stuff. If you practice it, it gets easier. And if you get it wrong and you lose your cool, or you jump into solutions, or, with suggestions, go back and revisit that conversation and say, hands up. When you said that, I didn't get that right. I didn't listen to you. And I'd really like to try and have that conversation again. You might explain, actually, I panicked a bit. I was worried. It made me feel lots of emotions, and I let those get the better of me. And that wasn't right. I didn't give you the space and the listening that you deserved. And ask for that second chance. What we're really doing here is we're moving from towards coaching and influencing strategies. And that means, first of all, listening to understand. It's not that we're abandoning our teens in their problems, it's that we are trying to bypass their defensiveness by, number one, understanding, and then perhaps being very gentle in the ways that we influence them, rather than saying, trying to prise them open, saying, "What's the problem?" Being a bit more tentative. "I get the feeling you might have something on your mind at the moment. It looks like, from the outside, that there might be something worrying you. I can't tell. I haven't got a window into your mind, but I wondered if that's what it feels like on the inside as well." So being tentative in the way that we approach that, rather than being directive, "This is what you need to do to fix this problem." Actually, have you got any ideas? Drawing on their expertise rather than judging. So that's a really bad idea. Actually exploring, I wonder what might happen if you do that, rather than disagreeing. And this might be in any conversation. I totally disagree with you. Say, "Okay, so what led you to that conclusion?" Opening up conversations with curiosity rather than closing them down with pronouncements or judgments, and leaving them to think about things. I'm a huge excuse me, a huge fan of nudging teens and then leaving them to think about stuff. Well, have a think about it and we can talk again later. Um, and rather than kind of condemning when they do things wrong, saying, "That was a big call. How do you feel about it?" And this is a really fundamentally different way of approaching conversations than perhaps we might use when they're younger. It's less directive, it's more collaborative. Oh, excuse me. And it is more that coaching relationship. And that's what we're trying to move towards. I'm going to finish up in a minute. I really hope you found that helpful, but I did just want to remind you that there are some conversations, some topics that we do need to talk about. Things like mental health, things like sex, bodies, relationships, consent, things like pornography, the online world, drugs, alcohol, personal safety. These are all topics that we need to be able to talk to our teens about in order to signal clearly to them that we're able to talk about these issues with them, and that, that no topic is off bounds. I think my advice, often parents are like, "Well, how do I talk about these difficult topics?" Everything I've said about choosing your moment, that maybe being indirect, about thinking about being side by side, that all applies. But also just taking a deep breath and doing it. Maybe taking a guess, or, I've heard something about something that might be going on. I don't know. Is that something you've heard about? For example, use everyday situations and conversations. Often we get best into difficult conversations when we have a launch pad. So, as I said, yesterday the government announced the upcoming ban on social media. Brilliant opportunity to talk about social media, to talk about how they feel about it, how they experience it, what they value about it, maybe what harms they've experienced or that they think younger children should be protected from, to talk about things as a topic rather than approaching our teen and saying, "What have you done on social media that perhaps, I would want to know about?" And but we do have to be brave, and we do sometimes have to open up those conversations. Um, the more we do it, the easier it becomes. The more we avoid conversations, the harder they become. So maybe have a think about what's going on in the world right now. Maybe if you're watching this in, the recording, that you could use as a launch pad that might open up an interesting conversation with your teen about maybe a tricky topic that would signal to them, actually, this is something that I am prepared to talk to you about. I'm going to leave it there. The messages I really want you to take away from this: try to think about relationship building as underpinning communication so that you're creating lots of opportunities for conversations to happen. Pick up the conversations that your teen lays down. Every opportunity that they offer, if you possibly can, go into those conversations. When they come to you with something difficult, your default position: empathetic listening, not advice giving, not reassurance, just empathetic listening. They are far more likely to come back to you, and they will find that supportive. So if you can open up conversations with acceptance, with curiosity, rather than closing them down, they will get into the habit of talking to you. And if you find yourself in the position where you are trying to get through to your teenager, you probably need to rethink, because that is one-way conversation and it's unlikely to be successful. I really hope you found that helpful. Um, the QR code there, as I said, will take you to my website, to my blog. You'll find lots of supportive materials there. You're very welcome to connect with me and find out more about me through that as well. But I hope that's given you some insight into what's going on in your teenager, but also some really concrete things to think about in terms of how you approach conversations with them in a way that makes them more likely to open up to you. So the only thing that leaves me to say is thank you for joining us, and good luck with everything that I've said. I really hope you found it helpful. So take care, everybody, and I hope to see you again soon.